Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in the philosophy of mind. In this lesson, we're going to take an introduction to the first of our major theories concerning the philosophy of mind and the idea of the sort of general mind-body problem, this being the idea of dualism. Now, we're going to spend quite a lot of time looking at dualism because dualism has a number of different types, it has a number of different ideas, and it has a number of different proponents and supporters, as well as a number of challengers. So, generally speaking, when we think about the philosophy of mind and we think about this idea of what the mind is and the relationship that the mind has with the brain or the body, we sort of divide our theories into two broad camps. You sort of have dualist theories, and then you have physicalist theories. And within physicalism, you have things like, for example, identity theory, behaviorism. You also have things like functionalism as well. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about each of these different ideas before looking at some of the more substantive secondary issues relating to the philosophy of mind, looking at things like, for example, consciousness and qualia and epiphenomenalism and all these different kinds of things. So for now, let's just go with the first of the major theories. This is where all textbooks will begin their studies in the philosophy of mind. This is in the idea of dualism. This is an introduction to the first of our philosophical theories, and this is, like I said, the idea of dualism. Now, dualism is the most easy to understand, at least in my mind. The sort of way in which we see theories of the philosophy of mind develop, things like mental causation and functionalism get a little bit more complicated than just simple theories like the idea of dualism. But there are obviously distinctions, and there are obviously different elements of dualism that are a little bit more difficult. So, essentially, dualism is an idea within the philosophy of mind that refers to the simple view that the mind and the body, or the brain, are distinct entities or substances. Now, I put in brackets "or the brain" because when we think about the philosophy of mind, the body aspect concerns obviously brain states and the way in which the brain operates. We're not necessarily talking about the leg or the arm, even though that is obviously also part of the body. We're talking about the bodily part of thinking, let's say, the part of the body that thinks and is concerned in thinking and is concerned in where the mind would be, which is obviously the brain. The mind is obviously, if the mind is a part of the body, it will be in the brain. So that's what we're talking about in relation to dualism. So there is a distinction. There is a mind-body distinction. They are distinct kinds of entities, or potentially distinct kind of substances. Now, there are 2 or 3 different types of dualism that I'm going to explore. One is substance dualism, the other is property dualism, and then the final one is predicate dualism. We'll get to those in future lessons' time. But generally speaking, what this does is it contrasts with a distinct theory, which is monism or monism, which is this view that there is only one fundamental kind of substance or reality that exists in relation to the mind, and that is just that they are one and the same. So now, generally speaking, there are sort of 2 views in relation to monism. The first is the physicalist view, the view that I'm going to be spending quite a lot of time looking at, which is the idea that everything is just physical. So the identity theory, for example, posits that the mind and the brain are just one and the same thing. The mind is as physical as the brain is. Or idealism. Idealism is one that's a little bit more out there. Maybe we'll spend some time looking at it if we have time. The idea that everything is just the mental. So, generally speaking, this is how we would divide the philosophy of mind up. I'm going to divide the philosophy of mind into dualism and physicalism because idealism is a little bit more out there and is a little bit more abstract in terms of the way in which we think about things. Because if it is the case that nothing is physical and everything is mental, then we are essentially denying the existence of physical reality. Now, we can do so, and we might even have strong positive arguments to make that claim, but I'm not going to do that in this series of lessons, unless I have time at the end. So, Dualism, okay, posits that there are two different kinds of entities or substances or sort of things that exist in reality that concerns thinking and concerns mental states and brain states. There are sort of mental substances, parts of the mind, this sort of ethereal concept of the mind. And then there is bodily substances, the brain, the actual physical processes that we can measure in the brain. So things like brain states, things like actual electronic activity that goes on in the brain. Those are the two things that a dualist suggests exists. Monism suggests that there will only be one of those, okay? And depending on which of the two kind of monists you would be, on account of believing that everything is just physical, you would be a physicalist. On account of believing that everything is just mental, you would be an idealist or support idealism. So, generally speaking, we associate dualism often mostly with the distinction and the division between mental and physical realms, proposing that the mind is fundamentally different from the material body and the brain, that there is a distinction that exists here. And one of the earliest proponents of dualism, or at least sort of the most famous proponents of dualism, is that of René Descartes. René Descartes proposes an idea of dualism which is known as substance dualism, something that we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at in the next lesson in more detail, and then also talking about challenges 2 in the lesson after that. René Descartes was a philosopher who lived, should I say, between 1596 and 1650. He is often considered the father of modern philosophy in many ways, and there are some of the most significant and famous contributions to philosophy were contributed by René Descartes. He was also a very, very talented mathematician. When you do, for example, XY graphs in mathematics, and you try and graph lines or graph curves, like parabolic curves and things like that, you will be doing that on what is known as a Cartesian coordinate system. That is as developed and as named after René Descartes, which is quite interesting. So he made quite significant contributions to metaphysics and to the philosophy of mind. His views on substance dualism, the idea that there are these two fundamental kinds of substance in existence, are central to his philosophical system. So substance dualism is a variation on the broader idea of dualism. Dualism in its generality is this view that there is a mind and then there is a body, or there is a physical and there are mental states. But substance dualism tries to define what those things are. They are substances. They are distinct substances. And so with this, the basic idea here is that reality is composed of two distinct substances. You have res cognitas, I can't speak Latin. Just bear that in mind. That is the mind, essentially. Okay, this is the non-physical, the thinking substances. Descartes identifies this with this idea of the mind, or the idea of the soul. There is some quite interesting parallels between the way in which we think of dualism in terms of the philosophy of mind in relation to things like the philosophy of death, or the philosophy of religion in relation to the soul, and the idea of the soul as the soul being distinct from the body. That is something that is more spiritual in terms of our understanding of philosophy, and that is something that we will look at if we ever do the philosophy of death, for example, in the future, which I'm sure is a very cheery subject. Now, the essence of the mind is this idea of being able to think, to reason, to doubt, to imagine, to will, to have a feeling. These are all ways in which we can identify what the mind is and where the mind comes from. The body, by contrast, I'm not going to pronounce the Latin, is the physical extended substances. These are the things that are the parts of us and the parts of reality that occupy space. This is one of the things that Descartes distinguishes between the mind and the body, the mental substances versus the physical substances. The idea that the physical substances occupy space and they are subject to mechanical laws. They extend in space. They have dimensions. They also persist through time. There is this sort of spatio-temporal persistence that we see in relation to physical entities. Now, for those of you who have watched our lessons on metaphysics, you might see the distinction here, or more specifically, the similarities between This idea of something being physical, being something that occupies space and persists in time, as being similar to when we look at abstract entities and we look at material objects and constitution, and we look at things like universalism and nominalism. There are similarities between those two things because fundamentally metaphysics and the philosophy of mind are very similar subjects. Philosophy of mind is something of a subset of the study of metaphysics. So these two substances, mind and body, are radically different in nature, but they interact within the human being. And this is what is the essence of Cartesian dualism, this idea of there being interaction between the mind and the body. Now, or the physical and the mental. And this is really where it gets a little bit tricky, because you then have to think about, well, how do we explain the nature of this relationship? How can we explain the nature of the relationship between the interactions between mind and body? And we'll get to that when we look at substance dualism in more detail in the next lesson.